not do that. Okay, so welcome to Unconditionally Conditional, Strong Authentication in Microsoft Entra ID, formerly Azure AD until recently, because they keep changing stuff. So just out of curiosity, show of hands, because it looks like everybody's still out having coffee, because I don't know about you, but coffee and donuts or cookies is awesome. How many of you are in an environment that has Microsoft 365 or Azure? That's a good portion of you. Excellent. And you've all got E5 licenses and you've got all sorts of funding. Oh, wow, there's like 6. Okay, that's cool. So who am I and why should you care about listening to me? So I have about 30 years of experience in the IT industry, primarily in critical infrastructure, mostly with a security focus. Today, I work as a healthcare security professional in a large hospital service. And like things go, I won't name organizations in any of my talks. If certs are your thing, well, I have a couple to my credit. And over the years, I've helped build, mentor, and run a number of InfoSec projects for a variety of different volunteer groups over the years. And I teach black and white darkroom techniques because from a hacking perspective, who doesn't like something that's completely the opposite end of the spectrum of the things that we like to do on a daily basis? So most importantly, this model that we're going to be talking about is, and covering throughout this presentation, is something that I've been building for the last 6 months. It's tested, it's in production in a large enterprise. And this is the lessons learned that our team and primarily I learned along the way. A quick disclaimer, the thoughts and opinions shared throughout this presentation are mine alone, and they are not those of my employers, past, present, or future. An agenda. So let's talk about trust and zero trust. We're going to talk about devices and applications, conditional access policies and components. A model of strong authentication is going to be presented. We're going to give an example risky sign-in. I originally had some troubleshooting stuff, but I can't really fit it into the 25-minute time slot. We're going to talk about a few other things that tie in with this, some licensing, resources and links at the end, and we're going to finish it off with some conclusions. There is no need to take any photos throughout the presentation, and you should wait for the last QR code. But if you really want to play along, feel free to activate any of the QR codes throughout the presentation. So some assumptions. Authentication is only one part of your defense strategy. Authentication does not only apply to users, it also applies to devices, applications, services, and users. Authentication is also verification of your identity. Authorization will be mentioned, but will not be covered in detail. Something we will not cover. We're not covering everything. There will always be more, and you need to embrace the rate of change, especially in the Azure and Entra environments. Pricing, that's between you and your sales rep. How long is this going to take to implement? Well, talk to your change advisory board. It can take minutes or it can take years. So what is trust? According to NIST Special Publication 800-161, it's a belief that an entity meets a certain expectations and therefore can be relied upon. It's also a noun, assured reliance on character, ability, strength, or truth of someone or something. It's also a verb, to hope or expect confidentiality. So what is zero trust? There's a number of definitions that I've read over the last few months, and I really like this one, but it really comes down to, it's an idea to protect our data by always choosing what you choose to trust. But it's still all about trust. So why should we care? Well, the traditional thinking is the physical network boundary is the edge, and the firewall will save us. But we know that that's just a layer, and it's not going to actually help in the end. So in the cloud posture environment, we're talking about the data as the edge. The client is just a conduit to that data. Authentication is your gateway to your data. But most importantly, we have a legal, regulatory, and moral obligation to protect the data of our clients and our staff. When you're looking at moving your data into a cloud-based solution, especially with strong authentication and data loss controls, this can have a real impact on physical attacks while adding an entirely new attack surface to your environment. We're going to start with devices. So there is a variety of device join types. When you're looking at devices initially, and the Entra registered or Azure AD registered is useful for BYOD, but pretty much useless for anything else. AD joined is your on-premises devices. Azure or Entra joined, and I'm going to bounce back and forth between these terms, partially because it's new and partially because the interface actually hasn't changed, and it still has both terms all over it. So Azure join is something that's in the cloud environment only. When you join them together through AD Sync and a few other pieces, you end up with hybrid joined. So your Active Directory and your Azure Entra ID are the devices in both places, and it's communicating back and forth between those. What we want is we want our devices to be co-managed between Config Manager, that's a CCM on premises, and Intune in the cloud, and we want them compliant. So when we start looking at devices and application management, there are mobile device management and mobile application management policies, MAM and MDM. So MDM is device focused, MAM is application focused. MDM has config policies and compliance policies. Well, so does MAM. They both do encryption, but MAM does it in a container, and MDM manages, again, the full device. You can also wipe the devices. You can wipe the full device with MDM or just the application data in the container. When we're talking about application updates in MAM, we hope that the user updates their apps. In MDM, we can push out those updates. MDM is best for orgs and org-owned devices. MAM is best for the applications and BYOD devices. When we start looking at policies, there's a variety of different operating systems that you can have specific policy sets for. I'm not going into detail of all of the specific features and functions, partially because they actually change on almost a weekly basis as to what's supported. But here are some of them that have a reasonable impact on the controls for your specific devices, keeping in mind that there is an expectation that configuration policies will be applied before you apply your compliance policies. This is especially true on macOS. When we start looking at the apps, well, like I said before, protected data or protected apps run in a container. So they might seem obvious, but that means that things outside of the container are not in the container, which means they're not protected. So you'll notice that there's also a Slack, WebEx, and Zoom for Intune. These are the ones in the container. They are not the same as Slack, WebEx, and Zoom without the word Intune. One is managed, one isn't. One is controlled, one isn't. One is in the container, one isn't. One can be wiped remotely, the other one can't. And they don't talk to one another. They're completely separate. So when we get into the policies themselves, keeping your data in the container is the only way to meet your obligations to protect your data. To that end, the things that we want to deny backing up data to the iCloud or Google Drive or whatever it happens to be. We don't want users copying data out of the container. We don't want them syncing data. We don't want them printing our data. We don't want third-party keyboards, because I don't know about you, but I type passwords in on those. So I sure don't want that going into being outside of my container. So when we want to allow things, we want to allow saving from OneDrive or to OneDrive, because that's in the container and we still get to control that. We want to allow numeric pins. Why? Because we don't want our users to hate us. We do want to allow them to use biometrics also, because we don't want our users to hate us. But again, coming back to things that we aren't sure we should do, blocking notifications. Does that really matter? Well, maybe if you're in the nuclear industry and you're building nuclear power plants, you might want to block notifications so that there's no pop-up on the screen. But really, is it really that much of a big data loss if an individual is in the wrong spot and they do something silly and they have a pop-up that has the name of a person and the subject? Unless somebody's sending subjects that actually have patient names in them, which should never, ever, ever happen, you're not likely going to have a problem. So is that a risk? I don't know if it is. Forcing PIN resets after a period of time. Who thinks forcing a PIN reset, put up your hands, after 30 days is a great idea? Yeah, no hands, not one. Why? Because all you're going to end up with is 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 3, 1, 1, 1. Anyways, you get the point. MAM policies, when we start moving into conditional launch. So this is an additional feature that adds more additional controls on top of the user's authentication. So when the user opens the app, you can also apply these. So user has too many PIN attempts, no problem. Reset the data, or maybe wipe the data, or block access to the data. People's phones are lost and stolen all the time. We see all sorts of videos of it on YouTube and other things where people have had groups of people grab somebody's phone and it disappears and you never see it again. Well, after 720 minutes of not being connected to anything, block access to the data. Because if it's not authenticating anymore, it doesn't need access to the data. After 90 days, well, just wipe all the container if the device is offline. And that data actually, those settings become part of the app. So even if the device doesn't actually connect, it still wipes the data. There's no data, which is great for us because, again, we've met our regulatory requirements to control that data access. User jailbreaks the device, well, block access to the data. Minimum OS versions. There are some versions that don't support updates anymore. Maybe we should just wipe the data for any devices that are on an unsupported OS version. Prior to that, we block access after a particular amount. Or we might warn the user because that version has been deprecated by Google and, in a few weeks, because it's the fall, so there's another version that's going to fall off that list. And the same thing with Apple. Maybe we don't want that actually connecting soon, and we should warn them that they're about to lose access to any of the data because they're using a BYOD that they haven't updated. Some of Intune's limitations. So all of these have been through Microsoft Intune up until this point. Privacy and troubleshooting with MAM is an interesting challenge. So when you're an admin with mobile application management, you can see from Entra, you can see the OS, the device name, and the OS version. And that's it, which is absolutely wonderful for the privacy of those people that brought all those BYOD devices. But it's complete hot garbage for your troubleshooting aspects for many of your staff on the help desk. Policy reports are inconsistent. So policy compliance, any of the compliance reports that come out, the only one that I've actually found that's of any value, especially for the MDM policies, is the per setting non-compliance, because you'll actually be able to identify which specific setting it's failing on a per policy basis. Config Manager, SCCM, is going away for 2020 in 2024 Q1 with respect to any integration with cloud management policies. So if you were banking on using your SCCM as a compliance policy, you might as well stop now. There's no point in implementing it. Hybrid joining is important. It's complicated. If you don't hybrid join your on-premise devices, they're not joined to a domain, which from the Intune perspective, which means they're not joined to your Azure Active Directory, which means they're not a trusted device. So you have to have group policies in place. You have to have your Active Directory Federation services in place. You have to have your AD or Entra sync, depending on which name you're using this week. You have to work closely with your SCCM team to make sure that SCCM is talking to the cloud management gateway, which talks to Intune. All these pieces have to be together before any of this stuff is going to work properly. And you need to make sure that the new SCCM client is applied to all of your devices. Policy filters are an interesting art. They're really, really helpful, but you need to make sure that you're applying them correctly. An interesting side, the policy filters only apply to devices that are in your MDM. So if you, for example, had, say, a contractor that regularly connected to your environment over VPN to provide you with all sorts of support, and you're thinking, okay, that's cool, he's connecting, and you notice he connects with Windows 7 every single time. And you think, okay, that's no problem. I'll just put in a filter that says Windows 10 and below, pick the current rev. I'm not going to allow that device to connect. Well, guess what? If you haven't onboarded his device, his contractor device that he's not going to let you onboard into your MDM, the policy filter doesn't apply. So now what? Well, that means that you have to apply that with VPN controls on the client instead. When we're talking about iOS and Mac, you have reduced visibility unless you are using the device enrollment program. It's not data execution prevention. Once again, here we are reusing acronyms in this industry. That's a complicated process that has to be done essentially at a device wipe time. And then when we start looking at configuration policies, you can't apply compliance policies on a Mac until you've applied config policies first. Because if you don't, what will happen is you'll require that they have an 8-character simple password, and it'll brick their device because for some reason their password that's 24 characters, upper and lower case, doesn't want to be recognized as an actually compliant password. I have no idea why, but yes, I have bricked a couple devices like this, and it was not a happy day. So when we move into conditional access, we're starting to talk about some signals. Who's connecting? What are they connecting from? Where are they connecting from? Is the device compliant? How are you authenticating? Is there a sign-in risk for your behavior? Based on that, we're going to either allow or deny or limit your access to data. We're going to enforce some controls by continuously evaluating your access, and then we're going to monitor and adjust for sign-in risk. Conditional access allows you to layer controls around your data based on signals that you have defined. It's central to a data-centric security strategy. It also provides you with just-in-time evaluation to ensure that a person who is seeking access to content is authorized to have access to that content. So, is everybody with me so far? Okay. So let's put this together. The closer you are to your data, the more trust you will require. The less trust in your device or location or authentication, the greater friction that's applied. Exclusion versus inclusion is important because, especially when you start talking about layered policies. Wide policies give you better controls over session settings, but narrow policies are better for your ease of troubleshooting and target specific issues. OS specific policies. What's your user base? Are you all Windows? Are you all Mac? Well, maybe you should pick the one that's appropriate and block all the other ones because they don't belong there. If it shouldn't be there, don't allow it. Browser only versus app policies. As we had the talk this morning with Dave, hey Dave, thanks for coming. So as we had the talk with Dave earlier this morning, especially when you're talking about the differences between browsers versus apps, there are different settings that apply based on whether it's a browser or an app. If you put them in the same policy, they don't actually apply quite right. So you're actually better off separating them to make sure that you're applying the settings you want. Trusted versus untrusted devices, locations, and user types, those are important. When we start looking at special use cases, device enrollment, security information registration, administrative users, and then there's some things that should never happen. Let's define some locations. Oops. Corporate, you have an internal IP range. Identify that location. Privileged access workstations. This is where your administrators should be working from. If they're not working from here, they shouldn't have access to the console. So that example where we had access to the Graph API via PowerShell to be able to query extra things, well, maybe you should block all of that because you're not coming from an authorized IP range. Regional locations as appropriate. We need to identify those. Where should your users be coming from? Untrusted IPs. Anything that has an IOC associated with it, you want to block that. So you want to have an idea of where those are. Anything outside of your geo. So untrusted geos. Well, there happens to be a Canadian government sanctions list. Start there. Allowed locations, you might have some of those. So what does this look like when you're looking at the entirety? Apparently this wants to jump. Right? This is supposed to be clickable. Oh, there it is. Cool. Excellent. So this policy diagram, you don't have to take pictures, is included at the end. So this should give you an idea of how the complexity of this stuff works. But when you're talking about a healthcare setting in particular, which is the environment that I'm specifically looking at, we talked about on-premises being a potential risk. But in our case, we have a lot of localized controls. We have NAC, we have compliance and remediation on that NAC environment. We have EDR, USB, group policy, configuration management, centralized patching and reporting, segmented networks, firewalled security zones, and that's not anywhere near all of it. So some of those things are in place also because we want our users to be able to work and move around freely. We have to build these zero trust systems so that we have the respect for our patients, their families, and their needs, but also so that they're protected at all times while our staff are moving around to support them in those spaces. Sometimes protection for that can also mean reducing friction for staff that might also already be in a trusted area, like an operating room theater. It's really hard to physically get into an operating room theater without anybody noticing. I have tried, and it doesn't actually work. They catch you about 3 doors back, usually. Guest Wi-Fi? Well, guess what? Guest Wi-Fi is the same as any remote space. That includes bring your own device Wi-Fi, anything that's not in the corporate network that doesn't apply to NAC, that doesn't have all those other controls, that's guest. As far as I'm concerned, you might as well be on a beach in Cabo. It's the same place for me. So things to block. Guest access for global apps. We want to do that. High-risk admin tools. We talked about making sure that you're coming from privileged access workstations. This is how you do it. Legacy authentication. Exchange Active Sync is a great way to get owned. Do not leave that on anywhere on your network under any circumstances. Other clients is SMTP and IMAP. So that's a great way for your environment to get hacked. If you have a requirement for SMTP, make sure that that's a specific server that's in your environment that is not an Exchange server, that is relaying your SMTP traffic from your old NetApp file shares or whatever it happens to be that you've got, your fiber switches, pick something else, and make sure that only that IP can send SMTP to your tenant. Nothing else, not one, but put an entire ton of telemetry on that device and make sure that the only thing that is getting there is stuff you expect. Linux apps, Mac apps, well, we said that we're not going to allow those because they're on untrusted devices. Windows Phone, just never mind. So Windows apps on an unmanaged device. If it's unmanaged, you don't control the data. If you have access to the apps, you can download data out of the app onto the device. If you don't control the data, you don't control, or if you don't control the device, you don't control the data. Mobile browsers. So if it's Exchange Online or SharePoint Online, don't allow access to that over a mobile browser. You're thinking, why would you do that? Well, there's an app. There's an Exchange, an Outlook app, and a SharePoint app. If you control the data in the app, you control the data. If you leave it outside that browser, you used to have way less control over that data, and you open yourself up to token replay attacks. So don't allow it. Security information registration from off-prem. So in a case with security information registration, this one's kind of funny. If you sync, say, 16,000 users cloud because you want your global address list to have all your users in it before you migrate all your users, and we have some assumptions around here that all of our users use strong, complex, and unique passwords. But just in case they don't, we want to put in some guardrails. And the reason for that is it ends up that the first person who authenticates to the Azure tenant with a username and password gets to register the MFA. And guess who owns the account from that point forward? So don't allow it from off premises. Make them come on-prem. Yeah, okay, so you're not going to be anybody's friend at the beginning, but we need to make sure that we've secured their authentication and got them to a trusted state before we start migrating into those circumstances. And we do have things like Zoom or Teams or whatever happens to be. Your help desk has a way to validate people. You should use that. Unknown or untrusted device platforms. If it's not in one of the list of supported device platforms, don't ever let it anywhere near your tenant. And I have an example of that later. Locations, so exclude, you exclude everybody and you allow the one location that you've trusted. Untrusted locations as an include. This is for those things that are on that sanction list. This makes sure that when you allow people later to go internationally, that they still can't get to you from Canada because we don't trust Canada, right? So session tokens, session terms of use and risk policies. Administrators should be required to use MFA no matter what, but we're not going to use the MFA option. We're going to use the authentication strength, and we're going to require a reduced sign-in frequency. If you're using browser, no browser persistence, not ever. If somebody closes a browser and reopens it, they should never, ever get their session back, not ever. MDM enrollment. Limiting downloads. When we limit downloads, we're making sure that if you are coming from an untrusted device, you don't get to download files because that would be to an untrusted device, and we'd lose access or lose control over that. Now, that doesn't stop someone from pulling out their phone and going, "Oh, I'm going to take a picture of that." But what it does is it stops those casual decisions. Terms of use. Great way to apply your administrative controls and make sure that everybody's following them because everyone follows administrative controls. Sign-in risk. If it's a high sign-in risk, that's anybody that's coming from a malicious IP or an unfamiliar sign-in location that's really, really malicious because it's usually on a CTI list, block that access. Everybody else gets MFA. And when you MFA, you also reset your user and your sign-in risk, which is great. What about users? If a user hits a high sign-in risk, change their password. They can do it remotely after they've signed up for self-service password reset, and they're using 2 factors to do it. And 2 factors at that point, it's okay to use SMS because you're using an authenticator push. So that's still valid, 2 valid factors at that point. Allow policies. On-prem, we talked about apps and browsers are allowed. Longer sign-in frequency is actually appropriate because single sign-on actually applies. So when they authenticate every time they log in, they're actually authenticating back to the Azure Active Directory, and you show a full Windows sign-in in the AAD every single time. For those approved for international travel, there's your policy. Guests, if you need that, maybe you should have some controls in there. Multi-factor would be a good choice. MFA for VPN. So if you have a VPN, you probably don't have your contractors in that environment. You want to make sure that you're applying authentication strength against those. Nice, short sign-in frequencies for those. So off-premises allow policies. This is where it starts to get really complicated because we're going to allow mobile apps with device compliance with application compliance, so an application protection policy within the Intune side that we talked about earlier. And we're going to use the mobile the authentication strength. The reason we're doing that and we're not doing MFA, because you'll notice there's an MFA option, that's actually a deprecated control. It's not actually planned anymore. We're also going to disable resilience defaults for everyone. And we're requiring that multi-factor authentication strength for everyone. There are no exceptions. Everyone off-prem always gets MFA, no matter what. Disabling resilience defaults. So that token replay that we saw this morning, this actually stops that in a very large number of circumstances. What this does is if you grab the session token with Evil Proxy or Evil Nginx or something else, and someone already has managed to get your token based on your post MFA, and they can replay that token. Well, because you've disabled resilience, if your IP address changes, the new session doesn't connect anymore. So this doesn't work all the time, but this reduces that. Microsoft has also just recently added something called token protection. It's very new. It's so new, it's in preview, and it actually came out in the last few weeks, and I have no idea anything about how well it works. But what I do know is that there are so many restrictions around its use. It's not ready for me. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Mobile devices. Yes, I know I'm a couple of minutes over time now. Mobile devices. So when we're talking about untrusted devices, if you are using, Outlook is allowed with a longer sign-in frequency. Non-MAM means MDM. So if it's outside the container, it falls back to the device compliance policies. And that is an interesting one because sometimes they'll do something like Teams has an extra component that they add because Teams has like 1 million components. And that one component they mess up, it's outside the container. Guess what? That one piece now falls back to your device compliance and it's not leaking data. So when Microsoft fixes that with an update that your users now have to go apply, you can ask them to go apply that update because you're using MAM and you can't control their updates. Trusted devices. So Windows, we talked about browsers earlier. Mac, Windows, Linux. If it's an untrusted device, short sign-in frequency, no downloads. And when we get into trusted devices, browsers that are Azure AD joined or hybrid Azure AD joined, which Microsoft now calls Microsoft Entra ID joined, or hybrid Entra ID joined, or HEY, depending on your perspective. They can have a longer sign-in frequency, a few days. Compliance policies apply as per Intune, and they're allowed to download files because I get to remotely wipe that device. So I don't have to worry about it in the same way. I know it's encrypted. I know I can wipe the device. The same thing goes for apps. They can download files because I have control over the device and I have control over my requirements. Exclude policies. Anything you want to test, you want to be able to exclude. Break glass account, you want to exclude that. An example, risky sign-in. You remember I was mentioning no OSs, no information around what's going on there? Well, that's where you stick that. You'll notice that there are 2 separate policies that hit on that. One of them is block unknown or unsupported OS. One of them is block high-risk sign-in. This is what it looks like when you put it all together. And then, are you ready for the race? But wait, there's more. Authentication, context, and PIM, you can require FIDO2 tokens using this stuff all layered together. just for your administrators to escalate to global admin. You can also apply this to conditional access or to sensitivity. So you could turn around and say, okay, this is PHI. You're required to be in the place I trust and only the place I trust. Data loss prevention ties in with these. Licensing is very important. E3 or higher, E5 compliance or higher. And that's all the only parts we talked about. So there's a little bit more in here. So let's talk about conclusions quickly. Authentication starts with devices, clients, and apps. Hybrid joined for hybrid orgs. Entra joined for cloud-based orgs. BYOD is only for registering is only for BYOD. Require compliance. MDM for devices, but layer MAM for applications. User authentication methods matter. Things change. Check them quarterly. Licenses are important. So are your logs. There's a whole ton of links. Two that are important are the CISA SCUBA standard, and the Australian government has a really awesome blueprint. There is no time for questions, but please activate the QR codes, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Don. That was quite the race condition.
I was hoping for somebody to activate the QR code. This is the real QR code. Thank you for playing the QR code game. Nobody, unfortunately, got rickrolled on the way through. So,
okay. Yes. Thank you so much. Yeah.